Uh, there are students here and there are Nobel Prizes here, so I'll try to explain a little bit before I go on into the deep depth of the model. So I'll go to the background to explain what the paper is about. So this is a paper that I have with Insoo Kim, who is a former student from UC Riverside. And so here the outline, I'm going to give the background and motivation, and then explain the model that we're proposing, and give a background of the literature review and present the model and then the results. So basically, we are looking at the new Keynesian-Phillips curve, and this is based on the behavior of optimized behavior of price setters, basically assuming that there are nominal rigidities. And the most common ways to assume that are the staggered contracts of Taylor, Calvo, and the quadratic adjustment of Rothenberg. And this framework is widely used for monetary policy. And the idea is that this price rigidity is the main mechanism that transmits monetary policy shocks. The idea is that if firms cannot adjust prices, then in the presence of a shock, they adjust the employment and production levels. And so the most popular ways to derive this new Keynesian Phillips curve is the Calvo staggered price setting. In here, the idea is that only a fraction of the firms are able to adjust the price to the optimal level, and the other fraction does not. And this is a random variable that decides that. And the idea is that they respond to different types of shocks, but not all the firms are able to do that. And Rothenberg, on the other hand, assumed that the firms set price to minimize some costs. So there are some quadratic costs adjusting prices that prevent the firms to adjusting fully too. And both are designed to model sticky prices. The idea is that Cal is more related to the frequency of the prices, how often firms change prices. And Rothenberg is associated with the size, how large the adjustments are. So the new Keynesian-Phillips curve has some appeal, but there's a growing literature that criticizes the empirical shortcomings. One of the main criticisms is the ability of this model to match some stylized effects on inflation dynamics and the effect of monetary policy. One of them is that this model does not generate inflation persistence. So prices are sticky, they respond slowly to shocks, but not inflation. And another result is that monetary policy shocks in this model does not impact output first and then cause a gradual effect on inflation. Basically, a shock causes inflation to move right away. So Moore and Nelson and others argue that for a model like this to fully explain the properties of the time series require that not only prices but also inflation rate be sticky. And so this is the failure of these models, and these observations are the motivations for the model that we propose here. So in this paper, we propose a DSG model, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, that endogenously generates inflation persistence. So basically, we consider the firm face two sources of price rigidities, and that they're related to the inability of the firm to adjust fully the price to the optimal level, and also not as frequent as they would like. So firms do change the price periodically, but not all the way. So in essence, what we're doing here, we are combining Calvo pricing with Rothenberg. As far as we know, that has not been done in the literature. And as a result, we find that the model captures the desired effect of monetary policy, having a slow and gradual effect on inflation, and also capture other features of the data, for example, the cross-dynamic correlation between inflation and output gap, as I'm going to explain. Okay, so let me go back to the literature and show what has been done. This is not the only model that does that. A lot of other models does too have inflation to be persistent. So the alternative new Keynesian-Phillips curve model that are most popular are the stick information model and models that are so-called backward rule of thumb. The stick information, for example, the Mencken and Reyes 2002, is based on the idea that information is costly, and therefore it's disseminated slowly. So price adjusts continuously, but information does not. Okay. So with that, the model achieves inflation persistence. So we're able to generate here a lagged inflation in the Phillips curve. But the empirical implication is that price change frequently. And this goes again recent widespread microdata studies. So there are many recent studies since 2006, 2004 that shows that firms keep price unchanged for several months. Other models are the backward rule of thumb, for example, the hybrid Nukasen-Phillips curve of Gallin-Gettler. In this model, a fraction of the firm changes prices based on past prices of all the firm with a correction for recent inflation. But there is no justification why firms do that. But with that, you can put an inflation, a lag inflation in the equation. So basically what this model are trying to achieve is here. You have this econometric Phillips curve, and then you have the ones based on Taylor, Calvin, Rothenberg. And here you're trying to add, not only having inflation expectations, but also add a lag to inflation. And that helps the model fit the data. Another class of models is the indexation models of Cristiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans. I'm going to call that CEE model, and others. And in these models, a part of the firms adjust the prices by automatic indexation to past inflation. So with these models, again, you're able to include, they generate the lagged inflation in the hybrid Nukasen-Phillips curve. But some of them do not give a role to past inflation. Why is that? Why firms doing that? And basically, they assume that this is not coming out of a firm optimization behavior. So the hybrid Nukasen-Phillips curve is criticized for being ad hoc and not have this motivation behind. So what are the micro foundations behind this behavior of the firms? And indexation models, they do have some more structure, as a fixed share of the random Calvo type firms do set the price optimally, and the others are the ones that change according to past aggregate inflation. But the lagged inflation term is derived from the behavior of firms. But both these models, they also imply that price adjusts continuously. And again, this goes against the evidence, empirical evidence that prices are changed more infrequently. And this is not a feature of only these models. There are many other models that assume different hypotheses, but that they also imply that prices are continuously changed. So this paper, we propose a microfound theoretical model that generates inflation persisting endogenously. And that's going to come out of a result of optimizing behavior of firms. So the idea here is that, as I mentioned, we wanted to consider the staggered price setting of Calvo and the quadratic cost adjustment of Rothenberg in a unified framework. So what we get out of this is a Phillips curve that relates current inflation to inflation expectation, lagged inflation, and real marginal cost or output gap. And the lagged inflation terms is generated from the forward-looking behavior of firms. That is, the agents remain to be forward-looking in this model. And then we get the lagged inflation in the equation. So some of the features of this model is that they do not imply that prices are continuously adjusted. So because firms are not able to fully adjust, they have the Rothenberg, and they don't change it frequently, so they have the Calvo one. So in that sense, it's closer to the empirical findings. So this is a model that would be like an alternative to the existing ones. So what is the motivation behind this setup? So basically, we assume that the firms face two problems. One is when to change prices. So what is the frequency of price changes? And then here we have all these motivations that underline these models that exist. They are physical menu costs, or they are implicit or explicit contracts, which is found to be number one in the area, and number two in terms of reasons why firms declare that they don't change price often. And then the second problem that they face is how much to change prices. So that's related to the size of price changes. So here we're assuming that, as in Rothenberg and others, there is a convex variable cost. So the first one is related to fixed cost, and the second one is related to variable costs. So the variable cost could be managerial cost. There's a cost information gathering. There's a cost decision making. There's a cost internal communication in terms of changing prices frequently. Imagine a firm changing prices every month. There are also customer costs. There's communication and negotiation costs with customers. And there are other papers that assume, for example, that it could antagonize customers. They could get upset and decide not to buy anymore the product. This paper by these guys, Zebrats et al., investigate a firm, and it's interesting because they look deeply in one firm, and then they find that this firm changes price once a year, and then the manager declared that the firm react to major changes in the supply only slowly and partially, and that's because of the convexity of costs of price adjustments. There are not that many surveys that discuss the size of the price. There are many that discuss the frequency that price changes, but not the size. So we are running late, so I'm going to show quickly the model, but this is a basic model. Here, there's nothing that we do differently in terms of, we have two firms. One is final goods producing firm, and then we have a continuum, not two firms, a continuum of intermediate goods producing firms. And so the representative firm has the similar structure as the other models. I'm not going to go on here. And we have intermediate goods producing firm. And then here is where we have the difference. We have here Calvo pricing, but we also have the quadratic adjustment costs. So basically here, it's costly for individual price to deviate from the past price, and that makes the price sticky. But so we have two sources of sticky prices. We have the sticky price comes from the Calvo pricing. So here, basically, a fraction of the firm theta adjusts prices, and the other doesn't adjust prices, and this causes the prices to be sticky. And the same thing with the Rothenberg part. The quadratic cost also causes price to be sticky. So just keep in mind, QAC is the quadratic adjusted cost, and C is the parameter that determines how high the cost is. And then in the Calvo pricing, just going back here, the parameter is theta. That theta is the Calvo parameter. Okay, so the basic idea is that the firms wanted to maximize the expected profit, and but here it's going to be dealing with the Calvo pricing and with the profit and with adjustment cost, and the subject to the technology. So you have the first order condition, and together with the Calvo pricing, which is not working here, yields the New Keynesian-Phillips curve. And the New Keynesian-Phillips curve here, but then I cannot change. So so from the profit maximization, the New Keynesian-Phillips curve is derived. And then here we have the lagged inflation coming out of the fact that we have twice price lagged coming from the decisions. So here, just showing the difference between Christian, Eichenbaum, and Evans. So this is what Christian CEE do is very much the same, except that here we have the adjustment cost. And so if we log linearize, we can show how the inflation persistence is generated in the model. I'm not going to go into the details of that. And, but the intuition behind here is that the cost quadratic adjustment cost cause price to be lagged. The cover price causes the price to be lagged, so twice have double pricing, and it causes the price to be lagged twice, T minus 2. So what is the difference between the model that's proposed here and the regular one, the standard New-Keynesian-Phillips curve, is basically that we have this lagged inflation term. Now, it's not exactly the same as the other models. As you can see, the lambda is a combination of several parameters there. So this is not going to be the same. And the parameters are going to be related to each other in a nonlinear way. The Calvo parameter, the Rothenberg parameter. So the conclusions are not just linear straightforward. And yeah, behind the model, we are assuming that there is optimizing consumers. And so they are maximizing, and then they have a choice of consumption and labor. And then they have the consumption goods. So this is always standard as well. And from here, we derive the IS curve. So this model allows us to derive the small scale DSG model that gives us the IS curve, the Phillips curve, and the monetary policy rule. Okay, we're assuming that there is a central bank that's forward-looking. Okay, so then the parameters that we care about here are kind of hidden, which are the ones that are in the lambda, which are the Calvo pricing and the Rothenberg. So here we have the results. So these are the parameters, but let me show you the parameters that matter, that show the relationship among them. So we're going to look at 3 ways to evaluate the model in capital inflation dynamics. One, we're going to look at the estimate parameters and associated with the lag of inflation, the Phillips curve. We're going to look at autocorrelations, and then we're going to look at impulse response functions. And also we're going to look at how the data is matching, the model is matching the data. So first, what we find is that there is a strong evidence of this endogenous inflation persistence. The parameter estimates associated with the stickiness, price stickiness, are highly significant and positive. The coefficients associated with the lags of inflation, the Phillips curve, are positive and statistically significant. And so in terms of the frequency of price changes, so what the model predicts, remember theta is the Calvo parameter. What we find is that the degree of nominal rigidity is estimated to be around 0.75. So that means that about 25% of the firms reset price to optimize profit. And so that also implies the average length of time between price changes is 4 quarters. So, you know, firms take about 4 quarters to change prices. Now, looking at the data, the evidence, microdata evidence, is that price changes on average about 1 year. So if you look at these papers here, Kleno and Melin and Alvarez, Kleno and Melin finds that firm change price at least once a year. Alvarez looks at 18 countries and finds that it changes in every 11 months, which is close to a year. Alvarez et al. Look at euro area, so these two first is for the US. The others for euro area is a little take longer, so it's between 4 to 5 quarters to change prices. And Eichenbauer, Jamovich, and Rebelo use sticky reference prices among short-lived, looking at sticky reference price among short-lived new prices, find that the change is about 11.1 months. So all close to 4 quarters that we find in the model. How about the size of price adjustments? The magnitude of adjustment cost is large and statistically significant. We find that is 171. Our prior was 30, and all we get out is 171, and it's within the 95% confidence interval. And so the empirical findings are that price changes are much smaller than the size of the aggregate inflation. So there are some studies that show that. So, for example, Klenow and Kritzvold shows that for the U.S., they use consumer price change in absolute value. 44% of the changes are smaller than 5%, 25% smaller than 2.5%, and 12% smaller than 1%. And similar finds are for the euro area. So what is the property of the model, the coefficients? We see that there is this relationship with the parameters of the model. So here in the horizontal is the Rothenberg C, the parameter. And here we are looking at the coefficient lag inflation, the Phillips curve, for different values of the Calvo parameter. So as you can see, as the Calvo parameter increases, the coefficient on the lag inflation decreases. And when you look at the coefficient inflation expectations, it increases with the Calvo parameters and decreases with the adjustment cost parameter. So the idea here is that in the first one, in the lag inflation, once you have the Calvo parameter, you have one more source of stickiness. So it reinforces the lag inflation coefficient, the Phillips curve. But it has a trade-off on the coefficient or on the importance of inflation expectations. So basically, there is a trade-off between how the weight between the past inflation and future inflation, okay, implied by the model. So this is the same thing, but in a three-dimensional. The slope of the Phillips curve, as theta gets smaller, the slope decreases. As you can see here, well, one thing that is interesting to look at is that the main changes happen to when C is smaller than 80. But as C increases, you don't see that much of a difference. It becomes flat. And this is also the case here. As you can see here, around 80 or so, 90, the changes do not matter too much with respect to C, which is the coefficient of the Rothenberg quadratic cost adjustment. So looking at the estimation results, and then here we try different measures of output gap. And what we see is that the adjustment cost C is high and significant, and the Calvo parameters is also significant and more stable. But the Calvo parameter change a little more with the measures of output gap. And we look at comparing the result, which the second column there is our model. This is the standard New-Keynesian Phillips curve. As you can see, if you compare the likelihood function, sorry, it's the opposite. So there is the standard New-Keynesian Phillips curve without adjustment cost, and this is with our model. So the likelihood function is a lot higher for our model when we include adjustment costs. And then look at subsample. We find some interesting results too. Here was cut, but these are different measures for output gap, the same different measures. So this is the Congressional Budget Office, this is the AGP filter, and this is the quadratic trend. So divided the sample in two, we find that first, the coefficient across the theta is pretty much stable across the two sample, but the coefficient on the quadratic cost is less stable. And it's much higher on the second part of the sample than in the first part of the sample. So basically we find here and in other evidence that the size of adjustment, of price adjustment in the United States since the 1980s has reduced. And that is consistent with the fact that inflation is low. So there is no need to be increasing prices so much. We tried different things. We tried putting ARMA for the cost shocks, and then we still find the same results of a significance of the adjustment cost parameter. So looking at distributions of price changes, so now we are simulating the models to see which kind of results we get. So Rothenberg model, so this is the size of change, of price changes. So you can see the Rothenberg is skewed at very small changes in the prices. And the second one is the CEE, Cristiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans. So it gives also smaller changes in prices. And our proposal model is somewhere in between the CE and the Calvo model. And the Calvo model is the one that gives the largest change in prices. Okay. Now, when we divide the sample into pre and after 1980, we find the same result that, again, the size of price change is much smaller in the second part of the sample than in the previous part. That is, they are more skewed towards zero, and that's not skewed, but compressed towards zero, and it's consistent with low inflation in the second part of the sample. So here is just the absolute values of the price changes. It's just giving the same information that we have there before, but this gives the mean. And but looking at these numbers here, we can compare how the empirical results. And so Klenow and Klisov find that the price change is about 14%, and regular price is about 11% of the consumer price index. And this is what we are getting, which is pretty close to the empirical findings. And so this is the same information a different way. So let me just show now the impulse response functions. So what is the response of inflation to a contractionary monetary policy within this model? So the standard New Keynesian-Phillips curve model, there is impact of monetary policy shock and on inflation is immediate, but in this model, the response of inflation is gradual. So here in the first column is the cost push shock. The second column is the preference shock, and the third column is the interest shock. And I don't know if you can read from the back. And so here we are generate the impulse response function for several values of C. So C equal to 0 is the red one, and the most extreme one is the black one that has the highest value for C, which is the closest to the our model. So one thing that we see is that a positive shock, demand shock, cause inflation to go up right away and decrease slowly over time in our model, but in the standard model, C equal to 0, the red one, it drops really quickly. The output gap increases, and then decreases slowly, and in the standard model, doesn't have any change. The other significant effect is the preference shock. Positive preference shock increases inflation right away in the standard model, and in our model increases gradually and decreases slowly too. And then the last column, so that was the second column, first row that I just said, and the last column is the monetary policy shock, the interest rate shock. So a positive shock, meaning that increase in interest rate, which is a contractionary policy, implies that in the standard New Keynesian model, that inflation goes down right away, and then start decreasing slowly to 0, back to 0. And in our model, it decreases slowly and gradually, which is in accord to the data. So another way to look at the results is looking at the reverse dynamic relationship between output and inflation. So the idea is that output gap tends to be positive related with future inflation, but past inflation tends to be negative associated with current output gap. Okay, and what we find is that our model track closely the estimated autocorrelation. So this is the no quadratic cost is the green one. So it basically goes has some sort of a nonlinearity there, and then here. Within the red lines are the upper bound and lower bound is our model, and the blue is the model, and the data is the black one. So you can see that the model captures closely the data, the autocorrelation described by the data. And this is true for the CBO output gap or AGP filter output gap. So conclusions, I don't know how fast I'm going, but I know that we're late for lunch. So, 50 minutes? Oh, but I'm done. So, in conclusion, we derive inflation persistent endogenously from the model without relying on indexation assumption. We propose a sticky price model that's supported by the data, and we find that the results are robust across subsamples, output gap measures, and inflation measures. And we find also the distribution of price changes in impulse response functions, correlations are plausible and matching the empirical findings.
Time for questions.
Hi, Marcelli. I just had a technical question. So, when you derive the Phillips curve in the standard case, it's critical in the derivation that when Calvo comes to visit you, if you haven't changed your price in 5 years, and if Calvo he hasn't changed his price in 10 years, you're both going to choose the same price, right? So that's a key step in the derivation. But if I understand correctly, in your case, it really does matter because of don't you have to keep track of the whole distribution?
We assume that the same, that they change, the prices are all the same, change the same. It's just that the firms that change don't fully change them.
But if they have a quadratic cost of adjustment, if you haven't changed in 5 months, so suppose you got to have 5 changes in the last 5 months, and I only had a couple changes, say 2 changes in the last 5 months, then when Calvo comes, we're going to change our prices by very different amounts.
Yeah, but I'm assuming that all change the same. It's a simplification assumption, but...
So, no, but how is that consistent with the Rothenberg?
Well, it's not really Rothenberg. It's the idea of Rothenberg. But we're not putting exactly what Rothenberg structure is. We're basically saying that the firms adjust, the ones that can change prices don't fully adjust the price, and they face a quadratic cost, but not exactly like Rothenberg.
Okay, so I'll read it. I don't understand.
Questions? So I have one. Couldn't you do a statistical test comparing those densities that you showed us and then choose which model would fit best?
In the distribution, we didn't look at the data because we don't have those studies. But yeah, this is an ongoing project, and then the main thing that we're trying to do is find the empirical findings for the size of adjustment. You find a lot about frequency, but not size. So yeah, that would be great if we can find a way to compare with the data.
Any more questions? So let's thank the speakers.